So when last we met, we talked about what functions are, and if you've had some background in programming before, you've probably encountered them in some fashion. We kind of talked about their structure, and we talked about how they have a header. Now what we're going to do is get into the body of a function, which is where the actual meat of the function is, and this is where all the stuff that the function does, that's where all of that is going to take place. And so when you call a function in a program, essentially what's happening is it's almost like all the lines of code that are in that function are essentially like they're dropped into the main program. It's just that they're kind of stored somewhere else. So here we've got a function. Let's look at what this is. So we're going to include the IO stream and use the standard namespace. Now, if a function doesn't actually return a value, the type for that is void. One of the things we talked about last time was that in the function header, the first thing you do is you specify the kind of value it returns. Is you'd use int if it's going to return an integer, float for like a decimal value. You could return a string if you're wanting something that's like text. If it's not actually going to return anything, is it's not going to like spit out a value that you can use later, the type for that is called void. So the return type is void. It's not actually going to return anything. The name of this function is big pig. In the parentheses, it doesn't have any parameters go in there. All this function does is it just prints out a bunch of text. And so then when you actually run the program, this is int main down here, and all it is it's just a function call for big pig. It's going to call the pig, and it's going to output all this text. Well, this is a tale about how I got a big pig. Well, yes, this is a tale about how my pig's really big. For in this poem, you'll learn that a big pig's something you earn on your turn when you go to the sty that is owned by a guy who's named Vern. So there you have it. So that's just, it doesn't return anything. It just carries out some sort of action. And you can use this to like output greetings or instructions. We've done things before where we've given like prompting text to people using the function. You could dump all that stuff into a void kind of function where it'll just store the text. And if you're going to output the text over and over again, you can just do a function call and keep spitting out whatever those instructions are. So that's a function that returns a void. It doesn't return anything. It also doesn't have any parameters. There's nothing that goes into the function in the parentheses. We could use a variable in the function body the same way that we would in the main program. So anything that you can do in the main program is something you can also do in a function. So here I'm creating another function here. The return type is void. It's not actually going to return anything. The name of this function is bigpig10. I'm initializing an integer I. I've created a for loop, and all this for loop is going to do, it'll start at 0 and go until it's less than 10. I is going to increment, and I'm going to output the phrase big pig. And then here, the purpose of this, I'm initializing another variable, another integer, which is I, and the thing to note is it is the exact same variable. It's I both times. I'm going to call the function big pig, and it'll spit out the phrase big pig 10 times. And then let's see what happens when I output I. And the question is whether it's going to output 10 from the incrementation, or whether it's going to output 20 from the definition in main. So you run this, and it goes big pig, big pig, big pig, because there's a bunch of big pigs. And then you've got 20. So this, whatever the variable is in the function, it's like internal, it only applies to the body of the function. If you create a variable, the exact same variable anywhere else, it's basically ignoring whatever the variable that was used in the function is. And this is actually kind of a convenient thing, because if someone else is like working on a team with you and they use the variable x, which would be kind of a common choice, or using I to increment in loops, that's a pretty common thing. Well, the good news is you're not going to be butting heads with each other and causing problems and confusion because you've got the same letter defined multiple times. This is a reference to the scope. I think I just opened Excel by accident. This is a reference to the scope of a variable. I is only defined for the scope of this function. And then the I here only applies to the scope of the main program. Yep, that's all that function does. It just prints big pig 10 times. And yeah, the big takeaway is that the I from the loop is different than the I from the main program, even though they use the same thing. Let's see here. Let's see. So the function gets its own region of memory on the machine. The variable I is limited to the scope of the function. The variable I is also declared in the main program that is completely independent of what the function does. Let's see here. Let's see what else we have. So this next program, it's slightly different. It's still a void because we're not repeating anything, but then this time in the header, here we've got the name of the function, which is repeat pig. And this time it actually has an argument. So we're going to pass a variable to the function. We're going to have to enter in a number, and it'll tell it how many times to run the loop. In the body of the function right here, we're starting the integer, we're initializing I. We've got a for loop here for I equaling 0. I is going to be less than n. So depending on what value we pick for n, that'll determine how many times it'll print the phrase big pig. And then here, we're going to have much the same thing going on here, where we've got n equals 1. We're going to repeat pig 10 times, so it's going to print big pig 10 times. And then we're going to output n, and this should also give us 1 when we output n. So it's got big pig a bunch of times, and then we output the digit 1, which was the value of n. So again, here n, which is the argument of the function, that's also limited to the scope of the function itself. And that's independent of the n, which is here defined for the scope of the main program. So that's just a slightly different example of how scope works. And then here we've got an example of a function where you actually pass an argument to it, and it's got this parameter n that'll say how many times it'll repeat this loop. Let's see. So how about values that we return from a function? So now we're going to get into a function where it's actually going to return a value. So here we've got int and we've got num pigs. And so we're going to do int guess, and we're going to say how many pigs are there. The person's going to input a guess, and then we're just going to return the guess, and we're basically going to show them the number that they picked. So then what we could do in our main program, we're going to have an integer first guess. That's going to equal, we're going to call the function first pig, or the function num pigs. So then here, when it gets to num pigs, it's going to then kind of take a side trip. We start with int main, we kind of start at the top, work our way down. Num pigs sends it up here, and it goes on a little side trip to execute all this code up here. And then once it's executed the code, it's going to return whatever was typed in. And then here we're going to go back to the story, and we're going to say your first guess was, and then we're going to display the first guess. And so first guess is going to be equal to the output, the return value of the function. And the function is returning, the kind of thing it's returning is an integer. And it's going to return that integer, which we've called guess. So how many pigs are there? Let's say 20. So it's going to say your guess was 20. So if you're wanting a function to produce something for you, and your goal is to then take that result and like use it later and do stuff with it, what you're going to need to do is have a return value. And then here, when you set this variable that you've made, which you notice this variable is of the same type as the return value, you just give a variable name and then execute the function, and then whatever the function returns, that'll be the value of that variable. So all we have to do is include a line that says return, followed by the name of the variable we're going to return. And when the function reaches the command return, it will then end the function. So one of the cues for the compiler that a function is done is when it hits return. So here, let's take a look at this one. So here we've got a function called demo. It's a void, so it's there is no return type. We're going to output the phrase line 1, and then we have a return. It's not actually returning anything, but return is going to signal to the compiler that the function is finished. After that, I actually have more stuff where it's going to output line 2 and return again. If I execute the function demo in the main program, though, it's going to only print line 1. So it's going to print line 1. Once it hits return, it stops. The function is done as far as the compiler is concerned. So return is going to signal that that's the end of the function. It's never going to get to the line 2 command.